Most systems don't break by saying no. They break by saying not all at once. Limits are rarely introduced as alarms. They arrive as adjustments, small ones, almost reasonable. Think back. Most of us remember a moment when a familiar store suddenly felt different. The shelves weren't empty. The lights were on. Employees were still working. Everything looked perfectly normal, except for that small laminated sign. Limit 2 per customer. Temporary restriction due to high demand. Nothing dramatic, just a change. And here's the thing we often misunderstand. Those limits don't appear because something is gone. They appear because something is being watched. Our behavior. Consumption changes before shortages do, and the systems we rely on, they notice that. This isn't a new phenomenon. In multiple countries across different decades, purchase limits didn't start during a crisis. They started before people even agreed there was one. In the United States, during the early weeks of the pandemic, limits appeared on paper goods and cleaning supplies before any official supply warnings were issued. It wasn't everywhere, and it wasn't for all products, just a few categories. At the time, it was explained away as a precaution. Only later was it framed as a necessity. Or look at Venezuela. Long before the shelves were truly empty, purchase limits became routine, not because items were gone, but because demand patterns shifted in a way that was almost invisible. People just started buying slightly more, a little more often, a little earlier than they used to. That was enough to trigger the change. Because limits aren't really about scarcity, they're about behavior velocity. How fast people are moving through the aisles, how much they're taking in one trip, how often they're returning. It's a measure of collective anxiety. What's so unsettling is how familiar these limits feel. They don't scare us, they normalize the situation. Most shoppers don't protest a limit on milk or eggs. They adjust. They choose a substitute. They tell themselves they'll come back tomorrow. They accept it as temporary. And that's the entire point. Limits slow a system down without a direct confrontation. There's no big announcement. There's no official panic. There's just friction. And friction is one of the very first signs that a system is feeling a pressure it hasn't acknowledged publicly yet. If these limits appeared rarely, they'd be forgettable glitches, but they don't. They appear in clusters, across different regions, across different systems, always quietly. So the question we should be asking isn't the obvious one, why is this limited? That's just the surface. The real question, the one that gets to the heart of the matter, is this. Why do limits show up before systems are willing to admit they're under stress? We'll pause there, because the most important part of this pattern isn't the limit itself. It's how quickly, how quietly, we all accept it as normal.
Have you ever noticed it? That small sign taped to a shelf, limit 2 per customer? And maybe you've had this thought, a quiet feeling, that this seems early, that the shelves are still mostly full. If that moment feels familiar, then you've seen the first signal. We're taught to assume those limits are reactive, that they exist to stop a problem that's already happening. But they aren't. They're diagnostic tools. What happens after a purchase limit appears is far more revealing than the limit itself. Because limits are not meant to stop people, they're meant to slow them down. And once a limit is accepted, the system that put it there gains something incredibly valuable: time. Time to rebalance its supply, time to reroute its distribution, and most importantly, time to observe our behavior without causing a panic. A limit is a test, a way to ask quiet questions without a confrontation. Will people respect it? Will they rush to buy an alternative brand? Will they come back tomorrow for more? Will they complain loudly, or will they simply adapt? Every single reaction becomes data. What's so unsettling is how little explanation these limits require to feel legitimate. There's always a reason, but never the full one. High demand, supply issues, a temporary disruption. It's just enough to feel reasonable, but never enough to feel complete. And this is where the pattern repeats itself, over and over again. Limits appear long before shortages are ever officially admitted, long before new policies are announced, and certainly before a word like rationing is ever used. History shows this exact sequence. Fuel restrictions don't begin with empty gas stations. Medication limits don't start with an official government shortage. Food caps don't arrive after the shelves are bare. They arrive while things still look normal. And that is the absolute key. Limits normalize constraint while preserving the appearance of stability. There's no panic, no press conference, no admission of stress on the system. There's just friction. And friction is almost always the first sign that a system is under a pressure it is not ready to acknowledge publicly. Most of us only connect these dots much later, after access tightens for good, after the explanations begin to change, after temporary quietly becomes permanent. Then, looking back, those early signs feel painfully obvious. But in the moment, a limit rarely feels threatening. It feels practical, responsible, even necessary. And that is precisely why it works. This isn't about fear, it's about sequence. Systems don't just shut doors. First, they narrow them. And once you start noticing this pattern, this behavior, you start to see it everywhere. Different countries, different industries, different moments in history. The quiet, deliberate steps systems take before they ever say anything out loud. Because the most important signals are rarely the dramatic ones. They're the small, practical ones. The ones people adjust to without ever realizing they've already changed their behavior.